G'day mates, my name is Mordecai and welcome back to the show, where a new player reads various stories about tabletop role-playing games, with some having gone wrong. During character creation, it's fairly common to come up with some sort of backstory for your character. It's a way in which a player can connect to their character and to the world in which the character lives. It's also a means by which the player can learn some details about the world. Various towns, cities, or organizations, and why the character has become an adventurer. A good character backstory can also provide the game master with potential plot hooks to further the overarching story. Today's story is about a time when a game master decided to do more than just a little tweaking to a player's backstory elements as they became relevant to the campaign. This story is titled "The Time My DM Ruined What Was Meant to Be My Character's Story Arc," and is written by Codewave. So this happened roughly 4.5 to 5 years ago when I first started getting into D&D. One of my friends, we'll call him Jeff, decided to run a game with our friend group, which is an entire horror story in and of itself, but not the central focus here. Pretty much everyone in our group, including Jeff, hadn't had much experience in D&D, DM or player-wise, so we were all pretty excited. My character was a rogue, who had been tortured and experimented on, and one day escaped his captors, to then be adopted by a group of people, who I'll refer to as a guild, that took him in after finding him pretty much dying in the woods. I give Jeff my backstory and everything is all good. Fast forward to mid-campaign, when Jeff asks me if I could flesh out my character's guild, create a few NPCs and stuff like that. I agree, and spend that night coming up with a handful of NPCs, giving them names, personalities, the whole 9 yards, as well as creating a small love interest for my character. One thing I need to mention about Jeff is that he wanted to be one of those DMs that puts elements of a character's backstory into the world and give them their own arc in the campaign. Fast forward to what is meant to be my character's arc. My character receives word that there's trouble at his guild's base. Since our party was at a point in the story where there were no pressing matters, they agree to come along and help my character figure out what's happening. We get to the base and see that it has been damaged pretty heavily. Growing with concern, my character rushes in to see corpses lying on the ground, and monsters, some sort of homebrew creation, in the room he has entered. We defeat the monsters, and see one person is still alive. They mention a rival group invading and killing members of the guild before passing themselves. I never actually mentioned a rival group in my backstory, and Jeff never consulted me about including such a group. We then make our way through the base, seeing a similar sight wherever we go. Pretty much nobody survived as far as we could tell, including the NPCs I spent a whole night creating, and they hadn't even been introduced to the story until this point. Let's pause the story for a moment. Consider that we have an opportunity for the rogue to develop as a character both in the world and as a party member. On one hand, having the guild of NPCs for the rogue and party to interact with could make for a very roleplay heavy session, which can lead to the characters reflecting on their journey thus far. And on the other, having the backstory aspects take the equivalent of a fireball spell can also be a method by which to kickstart said development. But I think this should have been discussed prior between Jeff and the rogue. Let's resume the story, but there is more to say about the importance of communication as part of the afterthoughts. However, we seemed to gain a small amount of hope as we entered a room of slain monsters with a person in the center, my character's love interest. She was clearly critically injured, and on the verge of death, and for plot reasons, out of all the healing we had with us, including a cleric, we couldn't save her. Cue what was meant to be an emotional goodbye as her last moments of life escape her, with nobody really caring since these weren't pre-established NPCs to anyone except my character. As she dies, she gives my character an amulet and a sword. which comes into play much later. So, after a not-so-emotional moment, we continue forth, my character now filled with anger and the desire for revenge. We come across another room, with yet another living person fighting off monsters. We assist them, and it turns out to be my character's best friend from the guild. Jeff, for some reason, decided to include the detail that he had a broken arm, and had his sword slung over his back, resembling Artoria's from Dark Souls. He was new to the series at the time, and obsessed with it, so he did this also without consulting me. We then proceed to the final portion of the base, a large room with a tall ceiling. From there, we're presented with a large creature that's meant to be a boss, another homebrew creation. We have a long, drawn-out fight with this thing, pretty much doing nothing to it. Remember that sword I mentioned earlier? Well, during this fight, the ceiling was destroyed, revealing the night sky above us, with a full moon, and Jeff begins to mention that in the moonlight the sword begins to glow, indicating that I should use it. It's also another nod to Dark Souls, and specifically the Moonlight Greatsword. I then proceed to use the sword, and Jeff, who described things in a very over-the-top fashion, says that I cut the thing in half, only for it to put itself back together on the next turn. Fast forward to the end of an overextended combat session, and the creature is finally defeated by one of the big bad evil guys. Yes, one of. After that, there was some threatening by the BBEG, and some saving via teleporting by an unrelated NPC, and the session ended there. It was a nonsense show, to say the least, made worse by the fact that post-session, Jeff said the creature was invincible, even though during the session he pointed out that it had a distinct weakness. Years later, it's now a light-hearted joke in our friend circle, that's also used as a reminder of what not to do as a DM. In summary, Friend ran a D&D campaign that included a story arc for my character, which ends up being a disaster that resulted in the NPCs I created for said arc at the request of my friend being killed before even being introduced. Before the story ends, there's a small additional note to go over. Edit. Looking at the comments, I now realize that my title can give people the wrong idea as to why I was upset with this whole experience. I had no idea what I actually wanted to do with my character's future at the time, as this was my first real D&D campaign, and I was more concerned about enjoying the game. The arc isn't meant to be the point of this story, it's included for context. The main focus of this was meant to be pointing out how the DM specifically asked me to flesh out my backstory by creating some NPCs only for them to be killed off before even being introduced into the campaign. And that's the end of the story. I don't think the importance of communication can be understated. I mentioned it briefly in the moment of pause, but there would have been less issues if Jeff and the Rogue had talked about having the backstory characters killed off prior to their first meeting with the NPCs. Turning the entire event into a plot ex machina before dropping an invincible monster on the players was definitely the wrong move here. The editor's note included at the end of the story says it all. Speaking from inexperience, I think another lesson I could take away from this would be to talk and work with the Dungeon Master to create the backstory in totality before engaging in play. It might not have solved the problem caused by the DM in killing off backstory NPCs before getting to them. It could, however, have allowed the rogue to tell the other characters exaggerated stories about outlandish things the other members of the guild had accomplished. As a new player, these lessons are what I take away from this story. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe and leave a like. It's free to do, and you can change your mind later. If you have any thoughts on this story or feedback on how it can improve, feel free to leave a comment. Again, thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you all next time.